Welcome to this video podcast on horse transportation, where we've been and where we are today and impacts on the horse. My name is Dr. Chris Mortensen. I'm an equine science educator, a scientist, advocate, professional. I've been in this business for over 20, going on 30 years. And horses have been my life. I've done a lot of research in horses, and preparing this podcast this week really brought up a lot of memories because studying the stress of transportation is some of the things I looked at in my PhD as far as stress and effects on horses. So it's going to be an interesting podcast when we talk about the impacts of travel on our horses, what we can do to dampen those impacts. And at the end of this podcast, I'll give you some tips so when you're trailering your horses or transporting your horses, you can make the journey more smoother for them. So when you do get to your destination, they're ready to go relatively quickly. And we'll look at some of the data, especially for performance. Do you want to travel the day of your competition or the day before? So we'll look at what some of the science is telling us. And as I record this in the year 2024, we have the Summer Olympics coming up in Paris, France. And so you're having horses from all over the world descend on that country, and these horses are going to have to travel from Australia, New Zealand. That's probably as far away as they're going to come from, all the way to Europe. But then you have horses from Asia and South America, and then obviously North America flying over the Atlantic Ocean, coming up to compete in the Olympic Games. So how do they get there? And we're going to cover a little bit of that today too, because it is a fun topic. I mean, it just really is. And one of the reasons, we've studied a lot of this is because we know it can be stressful for horses. And so there are a lot of studies out there looking at the impacts of transportation on the horse, because out of all the livestock animals in the world, horses move around the most. So, and if you really think about it, any weekend you can go out on the road, and wherever you live, you're going to see horse trailers, or what we call down here in New Zealand, horse floats, horse boxes. Horses are on the move all the time. And then even I found this quote from Ted Friend, Dr. Ted Friend from Texas A&M. He is one of the biggest scientists when it comes to animal welfare and looking at from circus elephants all the way to horse transportation. And he was in the Department of Animal Science at Texas A&M, and I got to know him. His office was just around the corner from mine. And to quote him, he said, "Around the world, horses are transported more than any other type of livestock animal." And so that is where, his interest in research was. But they're on the move. They're on the move with us. They're still side by side us. And we're going to talk about the history here in a second, how every corner of the planet, as we've moved, horses have moved with us. Now, of course, you have cats and dogs and things like that. But I'm saying as far as large animals, moving these large animals, it's pretty incredible what we do with them. One of the studies that I'm really going to pick from, and I had 30 to choose from. And there's even more. There's more and more and more out there as far as research into this. But one that I found really had a good overview was the effect of transport and exercise on behavior of sport horses. And this is Barbara Padalino out of the Department of Veterinary Medicine in Italy. And she does a nice overview. We'll look at some other studies, but here, this data is a little dated, but she said in the United States alone, over $2 billion is spent transporting horses. It's probably closer to $2.5 billion now around the country each year. It's expensive, but it could be stressful and dangerous for horses. So we'll talk about that. And then she, in her opening, talks about, and this triggered a lot in me too, as far as my friends in the horse industry, and we're going somewhere in another country and buying a horse, or another, let's say you live in the United States, you want a horse from Texas and you live in Florida. Well, that horse has got to move from Texas to Florida. When I was a professor at the University of Florida, many of my students from out of state trailered their horses down. But let's say, and there's a study on this, looking at buying horses from Italy and transporting them to Argentina for polo and other sports. And those horses, how do we get them there? Now, I will tell you, horses are being transported by air quite a bit. We're going to look at that. But these horses, the study was looking at, was by sea, where these horses were in box stalls and on a ship, and they sailed across the vast Atlantic Ocean like they did hundreds of years ago. So, overlooking, and this was data from Dr. Pete Gibbs, who was one of my mentors. And he, in this, again, Barbara's paper, she quoted him, and he said that the typical Texas horse owner transports 2.5 horses on 24 trips per year and 380 kilometers per trip. So horses are on the move. And, especially like in places like Texas, where Dr. Gibbs was the extension specialist in the state, was looking at, well, we've got a reining competition, a cutting competition, rodeo, barrel racing, all of those things. They're on the move. They're on the move. And like I said, every weekend, no matter where you live in the world, go around and start noticing, because I'm going to plant this seed in your head, start noticing all the horse trailers on the road. And you'll start going, wow, I didn't realize. Because when you start paying attention, you're like, oh, goodness, there are a lot of horses on the move, especially on the weekends when we take them out to go ride or competitions. So if we go back to the basics, when horses first began this journey, this transportation journey. Now, in previous podcasts, talked about it, the history of the horse, the history of domestications, about 5,500 years ago. So that is when horses were considered domesticated as animals. And that took many, many years to get there. Initially, obviously, it was by road. Either horses were pulling carts or being ridden or being driven as herds across the Eurasian landscape, probably down into parts of Egypt and parts of Africa, up into Europe. That is initially how horses were transported, was just by their own hooves. But as you're going to find out, they did, there was some advancements a few thousand years ago where horses were transported by boat. And before we get into some of the different methods that the ancients used, the earliest records we have of horse being transported other than their hooves was the Persians about 1500 BC. So you're looking 3,500 years ago, where they were transported by boat. And think about it. We talked about the history of the horse and their importance to militaries of the day. If you had cavalry and you had horses, you were more successful on the battlefield. So again, my heart goes out to those horses because, again, they've bled and died with us over the millennia. But as a military technology, horses were critical to these early civilizations. And 3,500 years ago, they loaded them on boats. And these weren't massive ships of like sailing ships. These were, maybe powered by sails, but also oars. And think about, okay, we need to get our cavalry there. We have hundreds of horses. How are we going to transport them across this Aegean Sea or in the Mediterranean? And they put them on these boats. And the horses had to be trained to get on the boats, to get off the boat safely, and to stay quiet. Think about all this ancients doing this and how intelligent they were and doing that. So that is the earliest data we have, and it's based on paintings and pottery. And I think it was a coin or something. They said they saw like horses on a boat. So we know somebody saw that, drew a painting on pottery or something like that, or on a coin that, we saw horses on boats back in the day in the ancient Greeks and Persians. Now, the Romans were pretty sophisticated. Obviously, they had a huge impact on European and parts of Asia and African history. This was a good paper titled Historical Perspectives on Long Distance Transport of Animals. This was out of a veterinary journal out of Italy, but it was talking about how the Romans transported animals for entertainment. Remember giraffes, elephants, lions, and the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum and all the things that they did. But when it came to horses, okay, horses were also transported, and it was really interesting when you look at the data. They had carts that they would put horses in, and then it would either be pulled by oxen or horses of lesser quality. So these race horses of the day, or these big chariot pulling, superior horses, so they wouldn't be stressed traveling on the road, they actually had what we call horse trailers. Back in the day, they would load them up and they would get pulled by other animals going to Rome or ancient cities. So we knew this was a thing thousands of years ago, where horses were transported by early ships and boats, and also transported by an early type of cart or horse trailer or buggy or whatever you would call it. Then when we think into the Middle Ages, where the Normans invaded England, and that's in 1066, they had to bring their hundreds and hundreds of horses across from mainland Europe. But then you go to the conquistadors, and when they ventured out to the New World, Columbus's journey in the 1490s, Vikings, we've talked about that in a previous podcast, are thought to brought some of their ponies over to, say, Iceland and other parts of North America where they might have gotten there in the 1200s, 1300s. But if we look at the Europeans moving across the world, so the Spanish and the English and the French and the Dutch and all of them, they had to load horses into these massive ships that took months and months to travel the world. And you think about horses making that journey, like it's an incredible journey. So, again, when I think of the farthest reaches of Europe, I look at New Zealand, Australia, and those horses that came from, say, England or the British Empire in the late 1780s. It was 1788 when they first arrived in Australia, horses. And then here in New Zealand, it was 1814. So those horses had to travel across that vast ocean. They came from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, all of that, all across around Africa, across the Indian Ocean. And these horses were on these ships for months. So how did they survive? How did they do it? That's a little bit beyond this podcast, but it makes your mind think. And then when you look at today, horses are in a roughly 160 out of the 190-ish countries in the world. All these island nations. I was just in Vanuatu, they had horses. Fiji, they have horses. All in the Caribbean islands, those horses were, some of those are hundreds of years old, as dating back to, the lineage is hundreds of years old, dating back to Spanish and the Portuguese and the English. So these horses, if you really think about it, have made incredible journeys. And then in the United States and Canada and even parts of Mexico, transport across the West, from, say, the East Coast of the United States out to California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast, a lot of horses rode in trains, and they were loaded up on the train. So they had to know to load up on trains, and then they had to get used to the train movement and survive that. And of course, a lot of horses, pulled wagons or were ridden across the prairie back in the day in the 1800s in the United States and parts of Canada and stuff. But, you know, when they had to get them to point A, point B quickly, they would load them up in trains, and then they would carry them. So I put a slide in here to pause, because if you think about it, again, this is why I'm mad about horses. This is why, when I really sit down and think about these creatures that we share this world with, that we have tamed and domesticated and made our companions, and we think about these massive journeys our ancestors took across great spans of land and oceans. No matter where you live in the world, your ancestors were on the move. And horses were right next to us in the last 5,500 years. And then crossing these great distances, these great oceans next to us. I mean, again, for what? A small handful of grain, maybe bits of hay. That's it. They didn't ask anything else from us. So that makes me appreciate horses so much when I look at this history of them and what we've asked of them to do for us and with us. And they've made that journey hand in hand with us. And I know there's been other animals, our cats and our dogs, but just it's incredible. It's incredible when you really deeply think about horses and you just sit there and think about what these animals have done. And again, no animal has bled as much for us as a horse. Okay, so that's the history of it. So the history of transportation, I mean, it was obviously by their hooves at first. Then you had boats or ships. Then you had special carts for these prized horses being carried. Then you had, big modern ships, and then trains and airplanes. So now we have horses in the 21st century, and this started in the 20th century, being transported via air. So it's incredible when you think about horses on the move today. Again, they are the number one livestock species being transported. So air transport, the first instance when horses were first flown was in 1946. And today, it is common for our top performance horses to be flown around the world, whether for competition. I'm going to talk about the Olympics, how they're all going to get there. But also top horses that are purchased or shipped, even companions. People will pay for their horse to fly if they move across the world. But then this other thing is shuttle stallions. And I remember years ago, I think it was Lane's End. It was one of the top thoroughbred facilities in Kentucky. And their top stallions were not there. I was there at a conference, and it was the off season for breeding. And their top stallions were down in South America. They've flown them down there. They're called shuttle stallions, where they could breed with mares in the southern hemisphere during that breeding season. And then they would fly back to Kentucky for the northern hemisphere breeding season. So it was this concept of shuttle stallions. I was like, wow. And this was, 15 years ago. And today we have horses flying all over the world in transportation. I'm going to talk about that process, about how to do it. They are still going via sea, but that is now not as common because it is a little bit harder on them. The laws will vary by country. So in New Zealand, we can ship horses to Australia via sea, but not any further than that because it is hard on them. Long journeys where now we can fly them, which is much more economical. As far as it's going to cost the same amount of money. And so for welfare concerns, you'd rather put them on an airplane where it's over within however many hours that flight is versus, many days or weeks on a ocean going ship. So that is why you're not seeing horses transported via sea as much. Doesn't mean it's still not happening around the world, just not as much as it did. And that's just because it's cheaper to fly now. We're flying way more than we ever have in our history. And then obviously, horses are on the move every single day in trailers. In either you have, or these horse floats or these horse buggies, you have single horse trailers, you have up to 16 horses traveling, maybe more. Depends on the country, but generally, most everybody can see that that 2-horse trailer is pretty common, or those really fancy ones that might fit 4 horses. And then back in my day, the most I've ever pulled, if I remember, was about 8, maybe 10 horses when we were going to parades or football games, and I was pulling the cavalry horses as part of one of the, as my duties as their advisor. So I have pulled many horses, and then just training too, training young horses. I would load up a few, and then we would do, drive around a little bit so they get used to that movement, which we're going to talk about. The the trailers today, you see all sorts of quality. Obviously, you want. I'm not going to go in the specifics of that. That's not the purpose of this podcast. But obviously, you want something that's safe and approved. You make sure the floors are solid, and there's all sorts of quality. There's these high-end trailers that people can sleep in, store all your tack, all your feed. The one trailer I still remember this day as being the most luxurious was the Budweiser Clydesdales trailer. I got to walk in it when they did a stopover in Texas, and wow, those horses are so pampered. Air conditioning, beautiful, clean, fresh shavings. The Clydesdales are pampered like no other horse I've ever seen, pulled by a big semi as they go around North America for all their shows. Incredible horses, and that trailer, if you ever have a chance to see one at a fair or whenever they're around and you can peek your head in there, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing how well those horses are kept. And it was awesome. And you know why we're trailering horses, it's competition in shows or just going out to a trailhead to ride is pretty common, of where you see horses going back and forth. During the breeding season, you're going to see lots of mares and foals and maybe even stallions sometimes, but usually mares are going to where the stallions are. Depends on the breeding facility and type of breed and all of that. But during the breeding season, very busy, lots of horses on the move. Obviously, going to a veterinary hospital is very common. Trailering your horse there. Could be trailing them to a training facilities. Could be going to a horse sale or auction. A new owner, purchased a horse. They're trailering them to their new property. All of these things are reasons why a horse might be on the move. Now, here's a big takeaway in this podcast. Every single horse needs to be able to load on a trailer safely and unload on a trailer safely. I am a firm believer in this, because one thing is, if you need emergency veterinary care, you need to be able to put that horse on a trailer and get them to a vet hospital. Obviously, veterinarians can come to you, but if they need to do surgery or do things to save the horse's life, if that horse can't get on a trailer or has never been on a trailer and it's taking you hours, then it puts that horse's life in danger. And I remember we had a mare suffering bloat and a bad colic, and she dropped dead about 5 minutes away from the veterinary hospital in Georgia. If she and she was able to load, but I'm just saying, if we could have got her there 5 minutes earlier or 10 or 15 minutes earlier, probably could have saved her life. But, because it took so long to get her on the trailer and then took so long to get there, that it was a lesson in there. And then the other one is, I remember California wildfires, or wildfires wherever you are in the country or the world. You've got to be able to get a horse, if you can, on a trailer to get them out, to evacuate them. Or, if you've got hurricanes wherever you live, or cyclones, or, inclement weather, horses need to be able to get on a trailer. And this isn't the purpose of this podcast. We're just talking about transportation, but I just want to put that there. And you can either talk to your trainer or talk to somebody that's done this before if you've never trained a horse to trailer properly, because it's that important to them. Okay. So let's talk about going to the Olympics. This was fun. And as these horses, and I know specifically a horse here is in the United States in preparation for the Olympics. So it's a New Zealand horse for Team New Zealand that's training in the US. So that horse had to fly to the United States, and now it will be flying to Paris, France for the 2024 Olympics. But there was a really fun article just in popular press, and it's how do more than 300 horses travel to the Tokyo Olympics? Because that was the last Olympics we had, and that was actually during COVID. And it said business class. And for the Tokyo Olympics, just a few years ago, 300 horses traveled there, and they were on 19 separate airplanes coming in. And the US team, so because this was a US article, had traveling with them, 4 reserve riders plus all the Olympians and all their horses. They had 7 coaches, 6 team leaders, and 16 grooms to get there with all their 19 horses. And they had farrier and 4 veterinarians traveling with them. They had 2 equine physical therapists. 1 human physical therapist also came with them. And all the luggage, all the equipment, they said it was, and plus all their feed, because they had to haul their feed, about 1,000 pounds of feed and vitamins for the horses. And they had to get all of that from the United States to Tokyo. So they'll be doing this again when they go to Paris. And so they transported them on airplanes. And I'm going to talk about the process here in a minute on how to travel via airplanes. Uh, But it's really interesting. You think that the logistics of that, because going to the Olympics, it's you're competing with your horse. Your horse and your rider are a team going to the Olympic Games, and you've got to get them there together safely. And they're doing it via airplane. Now, I will say this too, there are a lot of laws when you do fly your horses. So they need passports. And then it's going to depend on where you're going. So it depends on the country's import laws, what type of tests horses need, what type of vaccinations they'll need, what type of vet checks, all of that, which I'll go a little bit more depth here in a second. But like one thing in the United States is to go across state lines, you need a negative Coggins test, which is checking for equine infectious anemia. And that's another podcast for another day of how that is transmitted to horses. But it's very rare because of this Coggins test, and that horses that are positive for EIA must stay on their property until they die. So it's one of those diseases that they've been really fighting hard to eradicate. But if you transport your horse, say from the state of California just to the state of Nevada to go to Las Vegas and compete, you need a negative Coggins test. And there could be other laws depending on where you live in the world. So always know your horse transportation laws when you do travel with your horses. So if you've never owned horses or looking to own horses, that is something to always keep in mind, that you have to have your vet checks and check your in the case of the United States, check your state laws, but internationally, check the international laws. Because imagine all those horses from Germany traveling to Paris. They're not flying, I wouldn't think. I think they're going to trailer them in, or Luxembourg or Belgium. I mean, they're going to trailer those horses down to Paris. They still need all of those, horse passport, because they're going across international lines, and all of those tests. There are many companies throughout the world that do this, and they will, as you pay them, they will do all the pre-checks. They will help you book all the flights, do everything during the flight for the horse, boarding, getting on the flight, during the flight, after the flight, quarantine periods. This company handles all of it. and that's what you pay them for. So then what you do is, and I'll answer some of the frequently asked questions, but one that I looked at was international racehorse transport. They're pretty big internationally. And so before the flight, a question could be, am I responsible for arranging any tests personally? When it comes to horses, they said no. IRT will complete all necessary tests required on your behalf. When it came to my dog, we had to take him to our veterinarian to do specific tests before he flew. Here, this company will work with the veterinarians and do everything before that. Do I have to apply for permits from quarantine health authorities myself? And again, no, IRT will take care of all that. The import export permits and at the port of arrival and departure. Okay, so this company's doing it for you. Next question. Do I have to deliver my horse to pre-export quarantine or to the airport? And it said IRT can easily organize transport. However, if you wish to deliver your horse, arrangements can sometimes be made. So you can transport your horse yourself, especially if you're looking to reduce costs a little bit. Next question. Who deals with custom authorities in the port of departure and or arrival? And again, it's IRT. They're consultants, their company, they will do that. Then they asked what quarantine's involved for your horse. It's pre-export isolation is required, on most exports, and the length is going to depend on where you're going. So it depends on which country you are traveling to. So, it could be a 2 week, it could be a month, or it could be a few days. It just depends on where you're going to with your horse. That will dictate their pre-departure quarantine and all the tests. Can I travel with my horse? Depends on the shipment sizes, the groom seats, airline policies. But generally, they provide a groom on board that is monitoring these horses during the flight. It's when you book flights, you work with them. You can, one thing was if my mare's in foal, I thought this was interesting. When can she travel? And it's going to depend on the country. But for example, horses may travel for up to 300 days in foal to New Zealand. However, only up to 240 days foal to South Africa. So again, it's going to depend on where you're going. Do you need to insure your horse? They advise you that you do have a transit policy. Okay, so that's all before. So you have to do all this work before you can get your horse on a flight. Then during the flight, is the flight direct? Generally, you would probably want a direct flight because I'm going to show you or talk about some of the research that's been done and the stress on the horse during flights. Generally, you want it to be direct, but again, it depends. If there's no direct flights, say from Auckland, New Zealand to Paris, France, so that horse is probably going to fly Auckland to Dubai, possibly, but Dubai is a very hot country, so you want to be careful there. But it could be, or it could be flying to Singapore, or it could go the other way. It could fly to, like, say, Houston, Texas, and then to Paris, France. So there's different ways. It depends on the transport. IRT handles all that, because think about it. If I'm going, say, from Sydney, Australia to Paris, France, and I go from Sydney to Dubai, well, you're bringing a horse, a big live animal, into Dubai. What are the rules there? What are the quarantine rules? What the horse gets off the flight, gets exercise. What is going on there? And then the horse getting back on a flight and then going from Dubai to Paris. That's probably what's going to happen with the Australian Olympic team. Don't have any information on that. I'm just surmising. So you have to think about every step. You can't do that. That's why this company does it for you. But they will lead you through that process and talk to you about, what's going to happen, because transporting our dog from London, England to Auckland, New Zealand, he stopped over in Singapore. And this is just the only experience I have of transporting an animal internationally. He stopped over in Singapore where he had a 12-hour layover. They got him out of his crate. He got to exercise. He got food, water. People were playing with him because he's a big black lab. Put him back on into his crate, and then he flew from Singapore to Auckland, New Zealand, where he then did a 10-day quarantine, and then he was released to us. And that's because it's my partner's dog, and she's from the UK. So that's why he came from there, even though I'm from the US. It's so looking at horses, it's the same concept. It's just bigger animals. And this company is the one that handled it. And the company that we were working with, they handled all that. Okay. What equipment will provide? So they'll give a head collar. They'll lead the horse is in their care. They take care of the horse. They do the pre-flight quarantine. They give them a loan rug for the stage of shipment. Should my horse wear leg bandages? They generally recommend against the use of leg bandages and wraps boots. If you do wish your horse to travel with them, speak with them. They have reasons for that. Should my horse wear shoes? They recommend they don't wear shoes on the flight. So they should be barefoot. But if there is, they do put a thing in there. If they have brittle hooves and they need it, speak with them. Are horses tranquilized? No, generally only administered if absolutely necessary for the safety of the handlers and the horse. So most horses aren't. And you'll see the research I'll talk about here in a second, how well these horses do. How is the horse restrained? They're in a big stall, and you can Google this and look, and I'll obviously show images in this video of different horses and different types of flights in there. I think it's hilarious when you see them all in there. It's awesome. It's so great. And so after the flight, so the post-arrival quarantine, that is going to happen. Again, it's going to be dependent on the country. There will be quarantine where the horses will land. So all these Olympic horses coming in will get there, a few weeks before the event and go through quarantine. And then once they're deemed healthy, they're released, and then they can go compete. But IRT will handle this when they get there, and they'll keep you in contact all the time. The company I used for the dog was great, talked about it, and then wherever they were quarantined, they sent us pictures every single day. He was happy, he was fine. And they do have veterinarians there to check your horse and make sure your horse is fine, and then you meet up with them once they're done with quarantine. Okay, so how much does that all cost? Because that's a lot. That's a huge, massive animal. And you're going to see ranges anywhere. It's going to depend on the distance that you're going, how far you're flying with your horse, anywhere from as low as, this is in US dollars, 3,000 up to 15,000 US dollars. So if you're flying internationally, going far, it could be kind of expensive. So one quote I saw from Perth, which is the far western side of Australia, to Chicago in the United States, this was about $14,000, and that was Australian dollars. So that's probably roughly around 10,000 US. So that's a business class flight, right? That's pretty expensive to fly for us. But you're transporting a horse. So in the grand scheme of things, if you're thinking about the costs of transporting these high-end horses, that's actually relatively cheap. You would think about it. I thought it would be like tens and $20,000 and $30,000 to ship a horse around the world. No, it's not that expensive like anymore compared to yesteryear. And you don't have to put them on a boat anymore and wait weeks and weeks and make sure everything is okay. So then that leads us into the next part of this podcast, is how it affects them. And think about it from the horse's perspective. When we do load them on a trailer, we're taking them from their home environment. We're taking them from maybe their herd or their buddies. We're putting them into this sometimes darkened trailer with some lights. So that is stressful for them. Then we have road movement. So as we go, that's different for the horses. They go back and forth, sudden stops. That's why you have to think about when you're driving with them, how careful you have to be. Maybe that pulls horses, you know the drill, but use it from the horse's perspective. It's different movements and sensations, different sights. They, when they have their heads looking out or they can look out, different smells, different sounds. Again, this is a herbivore. They still have that fear of being a prey animal. So that's millions of years of evolution. That's just not going to go away. So you got to really think it in their perspective. And that is why there has been so many studies on looking at the stress of transportation. Now, I'm going to get to the air one here in a minute, but let's just talk about the road one, because even to get to the airport, that horse has to get on a trailer and then needs to go down the road and needs to get off the trailer. And this study, uh, I laughed because when I was looking at all these studies, this one I remember reading specifically 14 years ago. And it was cortisol released and heart rate variability in horses during road transport. And Christine Orich I just saw her a few weeks ago at the ISES meeting. I remember reading this study years ago because my research was looking at exercise stress and impacts on physiology and specifically reproduction. And I was looking at this because I was looking at how to evaluate stress, how to evaluate cortisol. And when we talk about stress, it's one thing to remember is it's not always bad. Short acute stress is generally okay for the horse unless it's, off the charts stressful. Then it can lead to things like colic and stomach upset. When it comes to welfare, we're really worried about the chronic long-term stress. That is a welfare issue. Short-term bouts of stress is normal day-to-day life. We all experience it. Exercise stress is good for horses to an extent. Helps mobilize their body reserves, gets physical fitness, all that. So when I say stress, these short-term acute stresses are generally okay with the horse as long as we can help alleviate it and ensure they're taken care of and they're okay. So when I go back to that first paper I talked about, Barbara Padolino out of Italy, and when she talks about horse behavior, to quote her, the transport of animals is a complex procedure involving several potential stressors, including handling, loading, unloading, separation from familiar physical and social environments, confinement, vibration, changes in temperature and humidity, inadequate ventilation, and often deprivation of food and water. Factors are mostly psychological, but there can be some physical stress too. The movements, the strain, all of that. So when we look at the science, are we stressing these animals out too much? Because it's not just, it is better welfare. Obviously, that's always paramount. But really, the interest is competition. Remember, these horses are going to the Olympics. That's kind of the story we're building up today, talking about how horses are getting to the Olympics. But when you compete with your horses, or when is the optimal time to go? How long does my horse need to adjust? Is it too stressful? Is it worth it? Am I shortening their lifespans? Am I going to cause all these other issues we see with horses due to stress? So I get it. And that's kind of where the interest is, can horses withstand this? And when they look at the stress response in general, and I can kind of summarize a lot of these studies because it's just study after study after study, is there is a cortisol spike in the beginning of any of this process, from trying to load into a trailer, loading in the trailer. In that initial part of the journey, there's definitely increases in stress right away. They've seen it in saliva. They've seen it in the fecal cortisol and even in blood samples, that when they load these animals onto trucks and then they go, there is this initial peak of anxiety, stress, cortisol, right? That they observe. They've observed behaviors and then they've observed the physical response. So the takeaways from a lot of these studies is the beginning of a journey and towards the end of a journey, as far as the unloading, those are the most stressful points. And even things like heart rate have gone up. Now, the next question is distance and time, right? If the horses are going for short trips, like say to the vet hospital or competition's not that far away, versus longer road trips. And does that impact their ability to withstand the stress? From the studies, to summarize, if the horse has never been on a trailer before, generally the trip, doesn't matter the distance, is going to be stressful, or the time, if they've not been acclimated to this. Horses that are used to going to competitions like every month or every few weeks, they tend to do a little bit better, but there's still an adaptive period. So here is a quote I found after reading all of these, and this is from my old mentor, Ann Rodick. So it was Carolyn Stoll, and Ann Rodick wrote that in the course of a long journey, higher cortisol values are representative of the initial phase of the journey and have time to return to normal levels only after adaptation. So they were doing some of these road stress studies. And I remember when I was there when she published this. I was getting my master's degree with Dr. Rodick. And what they're saying is, these cortisol values spike, and then there is somewhat adaptation as the journey goes longer. In looking at standardbred horses that went on 50-kilometer and 200-kilometer journeys, and these are horses that are used to traveling, the shorter journey appeared to be more stressful when you came just looking at overall cortisol values. And those values do definitely drop as soon as they're done with the journey. But, it's so that's leading into, okay, if I've got to go to a competition, do I want to arrive that day, or how long do I need for my horse to adjust? And here they're saying, as soon as these standardbreds got to the racetrack, they would need food and fresh water. And this is for every horse when they get there. And they need at least 4 hours before they can begin any sort of physical activity. So that's minimum that a horse would need. You wouldn't want to trailer them up, get them off the trailer, throw your saddle on them, and go out and compete and expect them to be in the top of their game. They need hours to adjust, to let that cortisol come down, heart rate come down, all of those things, get some water, get some hay in them, and get ready for the competition. So I think that's a takeaway message I was getting reading some of this. Now, what does the data say? It depends. Different studies. One study said that horses transported over short distances had little impact on performance, where the effects of transport on jumping horses, uh, and it just showed that less experienced show jumping horses showed major signs of stress and lower performance. So in the initial start of that horse's competitive journey, they're probably not going to compete at the top game because they're stressed. They're stressed on the transportation, and that's again why you want to give them as much time to adjust as possible. A more recent study, just to quote it, carrying out a study about the effects of competition experience in transportation on the stress response in jumping horses. No statistical changes were found with experienced jumpers, which have traveled before. So again, that adaptation, that horse getting used to, I've done this before, okay, I know what to expect, versus that, hey, this is your first time. Now, before I get to the tips, I do want to talk about horses and their transportation in the air, because I found this study very interesting, that when horses were on flights, again, that whole loading process is stressful to them. Then the takeoff, because that's even for us, if we have any anxiety taking off, but imagine the forces of that plane taking off in the air. But then during the flight, the horses' heart rates came down, cortisol levels came down. They were fine. They had some hay to eat. There's other horses in the plane, grooms checking on them. During the flight, they're fine, but then that anxiety, or because again, watching behaviors, but stress all goes back up as that plane starts to descend. And again, remember, changes in pressure, changes in movement of the flight. So that horse has got to adjust to that. And as the plane lands, that again is stressful for the horse. So those were the two big periods that they noticed. But during level flight, the horses were pretty settled with it. And before I get to the tips, real quick, keep some of this in mind too, especially there was, when it comes to the health of the horse, there was an excellent recent master's thesis published by Kaylee Hayes, and I want to give her credit for this. Middle Tennessee State, just published a couple years ago. And it was trailering stress creates false positive results in diagnostic testing for pituitary pars intermediate dysfunction in horses, or PPID. This was Cushing's disease. And just to summarize what she found, that when you do a PPID test with your veterinarians, they're looking at abnormal levels of cortisol. And if you trailer your horse to the vet hospital to get this test done, or there's any sort of short-term stress before that's measured, that trailering, that transportation could induce stress that comes up as a false positive. That's what she was saying. So that's why I love science. Like it's incredible, very applicable study. Hey, if you trailer your horse to the veterinarian for a PPID test, give them she recommends at least 30 minutes post trailering to let those levels come back down. But you can take that information to your veterinarian, or we can take this information to scientists, to the veterinary community, say, hey, we found this result. If you're doing any PPID testing on horses, just give them 30 minutes to an hour after a trailer trip, so that doesn't impact the results. Brilliant study. All right, just to finalize this, horse trailering tips, because many of us aren't going to put horses on airplanes, but we are going to put horses on trailers, and we're going to trailer around wherever we live. And so this was, Equus, just written a few years ago by Christine Barraquet. And these were her tips. And I thought this was a excellent article to kind of finish on from Popular Press. But some of her recommendations were: leave horses untied or tied long while they travel. And that's because you want horses, if you can, it depends on the distance and what you're doing with them. But that way, if they can lower their heads, they can get some movement in their necks and their head carriage and everything. So we don't want them tied up for a very long time, because that can put strain there, and also their respiratory airways. Transport horses in familiar congenial groups. You don't want to throw a bunch of horses that don't know each other onto a trailer. Now, that being said, when we put them on airplanes, the pictures I've seen, I don't know if they know each other or not. So you have to kind of be careful with that. But again, if you can, these are tips. Again, these aren't laws, but keep the trailers clean. Yeah, anytime. Always clean it. You want it free from pathogens, free from manure buildup, all of that. Like I said, when I saw the Budweiser, it was like, wow, it was spotless, gorgeous. Educate your horses about loading and shipping. Every horse in the world needs to know how to get on a trailer. I will debate that day in, day out, because if you need emergency veterinary care, you're going to have to get on a trailer with that horse and get them out. Or if you need to evacuate your facility for any reason, that horse needs to be able to get on a trailer. Maintain good air quality inside the trailer. So again, depends on where you live in the world, but talking about the fumes and all of that on the road. But also, look at the trailer quality when you go to either purchase a trailer or use one for transportation. Rest your horses after a long journey. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, she says upwards of a week, because we do see illness. We do see pneumonia. We do see some of these things build up in horses. if they're stressed out too much and if they're trailered for too long, things like that. Keep the trailer in good repair. Yeah, I mean, especially those floorboards. If they're wooden, make sure there's no rot. Sturdy. The tires are checked. All of that. I mean, my dad was back in the day. I remember the story as a kid, and he was hauling young calves in a trailer, and um, one of the tires blew. And I remember he said the trailer was like next to the car. It was so scary, but luckily he swerved it and he avoided an accident. But anytime you're hauling livestock or horses, you want to make sure that trailer is top condition. Be a sympathetic driver. This is a big one. Any of you that pulled horses, or you haven't pulled horses but will, you've got to be very careful accelerating, deaccelerating, give plenty of space between other vehicles. You're pulling something that's very heavy, so it's going to take you a lot longer to stop. And you've got animals in the back that it's going to take even more distance, and you want to slow down or accelerate very slowly, because take that horse into consideration in the back. Yeah, ample water and some hay, but no grain. You don't want them eating that on the way for many reasons. And then each horse is an individual, and keep that in mind, because some transport fine, and some are stoic and whatever. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll go with you. And then others are like, oh my God, where am I? Oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, and they're just stressed out and anxious. So a lot of that's breed characteristics. A lot of that could be, dare I say, horse personality. So, anyways, when it comes to transporting horses, yes, it is a stressful event for them, pre and post loading. So keep that in mind with your horses. I think that's a big takeaway lesson of this. Yeah, it's fun to see the horses flying around the world, and maybe that becomes more common. Or maybe you're one of the ones watching this that you are flying with your horse around the world because you are at the top of your game, which is awesome. It's exciting, but just be aware. Yeah, horses are flying above us. They're going all over the world. They're competing all the time, and but again, when you're on the road, look out for those trailers and be courteous drivers to them. Realize they're hauling horses. They can't stop on a dime, and be patient behind them. I've been behind many horse floats down here and in the States, and I've been pulling horses around the highways in the United States. And just be a courteous driver around them, or be a courteous driver when you're hauling your horses. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and maybe something in the future we can talk about training young horses how to trailer. But yeah, if you're enjoying any of this content, please hit the follow button, like, any comments, appreciate it. And remember, you can always keep following us on our other channels, all the socials, and then always go to madbarton.com. That learn tab, there's always a whole host of over 500 articles. We've got our first online free course coming very soon. So keep your eyes peeled to that website, into our social media channels, and we'll be launching that very soon. But yeah, thanks for watching and listening. And yeah, stay tuned. More content coming your way.